Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm here today from Linguati. My name is Gabriela Grzybowski Gomulka, or Gabriela Grzybowski Gomulka, if you want to say it the Polish way. I'm sure many of you introduce yourselves two ways or introduce yourselves depending on what the audience is. Um, Today, again, we're here with Anna Staniszewska, and we are going to be talking about her lovely book. It is available in our library. Let me get it here. My Cousin's Mermaid. Um, so, for those of you who don't know Linguati is a subscription library of Polish children's books in the US. We have subscription packages of either 3 books or 5 books sent directly to your home every month. Once you're done reading them in about a month's time, you can return them and you get a new set of books back. It's again a library, so it's a subscription library. You get all the books, on a monthly basis. We also have a lot of kind of extras in there, coloring pages and different kind of activity pages and things like that. And so we've added My Cousin's Mermaid into our collection recently, coming across it in my search for a gift for Christmas, basically for my nieces and nephews and for my own children. It's a really sweet book, very heartwarming. It's about a little girl and that grows up in the US, and she's going to Poland, not for the first time, but I think the second, maybe or third time. And it's about kind of maybe not feeling like you necessarily belong because you don't speak the language perfectly or you don't understand everything perfectly. But her cousin is like, this is your home and my home, right? And I'm an emotional person. So I was like, oh, this is so sweet. It's so sweet. And, it was just really heartwarming. The illustrations are beautiful. And the illustrations are actually done by a Polish illustrator, Ewa Poklewska-Kozieło. And the other thing that I really loved about the book is actually there's Polish practice in it. So if you guys can see just a little bit, there's the Polish letters. They talk about a little bit the Polish letters that we have. So like w and u and sh, as well as kind of some of the definitions for Polska, siostra, syrena. There's a little bit about Polish history, about the Mermaid of Warsaw. So it gives you kind of a nice background a little bit into Warszawa, about the Mermaid, and about Polish language, which is really great, especially for people or for kids who are beginners. It's a really great book. And again, we have this in our library, but I do also encourage you guys to go out and buy it. It's a really wonderful gift for birthday, for Christmas, for imieniny if you celebrate them, etc. So again, thank you, Anna, for joining us today. We're very excited to have you. And so I'm going to kick off with just what inspired you to write this book as kind of an immigrant or first generation child's perspective of going to Poland.
So thank you so much for having me. So this book was inspired, it was actually sort of an assignment for my editor. So usually when I write a book, I've written over 30 books for young readers at this point. And usually when I write a book, it's an idea that comes to me or it comes from my brain. But this one, my agent put me in touch with an editor who was looking specifically for a story set in Poland. And that was all I knew, but that was kind of the assignment. And so I had to think, okay, well, what kind of story can I write? And so I've lived in the US since I was almost 6. My family moved here when I was 5, and we've gone back several times since then. But I really grew up in the US in Massachusetts, and so I felt like, okay, if I'm going to write a story set in Poland, I feel like more comfortable writing it as someone who's visiting rather than someone who lives there. And so that was the initial inspiration. And then for me, stories are really about a connection, about between characters, between people. And so I thought, okay, well, how can I have characters connecting? And so my thought was, if there's a girl who's visiting relatives, that, as I have done many times, maybe showing that kind of disconnect at the beginning and kind of showing her becoming more comfortable with those relatives and forming a connection with them. And originally, actually, the story was about a girl and her grandmother, her babcia, because and so I thought, okay, that because that to me was something I've definitely experienced as visiting, relatives. But my editor actually was like, there are so many picture books out there about like a grandchild and a grandparent, and she said, what if it's a different relative? And I thought, well, okay, it could be, I guess, a cousin or something. And so and that's really actually what the spark was, because in Polish, kuzynka means something different, right? It's more of like a distant cousin, whereas
Yeah.
cousin, in English is like it could be your first cousin, but in Polish, your first cousin, you wouldn't say kuzynka. So that actually was like, oh, that's kind of interesting that there's just even that like distance in the language.
Mhm.
And then I thought, well, what could they be bonding over? And the thing that I've always loved, since I can remember, are fairy tales. I loved fairy tales. My parents would read them to me all the time even when we lived in Poland. I just loved any kind of fairy tales,
Yeah.
and I feel like that I brought that love over of fairy tales over to the U.S. That I learned more fairy tales, and so I thought there's still so many that I loved from when I was young that are kind of especially what I love about Polish folklore and fairy tales is that so many of them are tied to actual places.
Yeah.
So when I thought about the tales that I could use to connect these characters to these two cousins. They bond over their love of fairy tales, and I thought, well, especially mermaids, because my family's from Warsaw, and so there you see, Syrenka Waszewska like everywhere, right? So I wanted to, because the mermaid is like a symbol of Warsaw. I thought that would be a really interesting thing to have them bond over. And so that's kind of, I took all those pieces, basically, like, those feelings of like feeling a little bit distant from your relatives, and the kind of nervousness of visiting, and then also my love of fairy tales, and I kind of put them all together into this book. And it was so much work. It was so much work because it was really a departure for me, like especially all the back matter of like all the research I had to do for landmarks and all of that. And at the end of the book, there's a section which is actually my favorite about kind of talking about all the stories that are mentioned in the book, all the fairy tales and folk tales. And
Mhm.
so I really had to like pick and choose which one I wanted to use, and then make sure that all of the research was right. So it was like definitely, more of a challenge than I was expecting. But that was kind of the whole process. So it really started just with one little assignment, and then I ran with it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it came out so beautifully, and like I said, I actually purchased this book a few times over for my nieces and my nephews. And my niece actually is 20 and just went to Poland for the first time literally this past month and a couple weeks ago. And she went to Warsaw, and she actually got a tattoo of the Serenka.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So she went to Warszawa and Kraków, but she did end up getting the major symbol
Yeah,
of Warsaw, of the Sarenka, and so she has that as a memory and kind of a token to keep with her forever. And
yeah.
the kids love the books too. And I mean, I did gift this to a 20-year-old. So, and I think it was perfectly appropriate and very much, hopefully, she felt the same way in terms of she got to meet her cousin and she got to meet an aunt and stuff when she was there. So I think it's very relatable for a lot of people who are going back for the first time or for another time, because those feelings are there. And that is the connection that is in this book. And I should have asked from the beginning, where are you from in Poland? Because I feel like my mom, whenever she meets someone that's Polish here, she's like, oh, skąd jesteś? Skąd z Polski? That's always like big thing. And so you told us, and it's Warszawa, which makes sense, especially with where the book is actually placed.
Yeah.
Um, so, what do you kind of hope that young readers or readers in general kind of get from this book? Maybe in addition to what you've already kind of mentioned.
I think what I've loved hearing from when I do this with story times and things when I share this book is that how that feeling of like not feeling connected with people, or that kind of feeling of distance, it's something that so many people can relate to. And when I do story times, I ask like, how many of you have like relatives who live really far away? And there's always like a few kids who raise their hands. And so I feel like even if there isn't that like cultural kind of boundary there, but that's kind of getting in the way of people connecting. Like I feel like there's still like there could be distance, there can be like a kind of like an age gap or whatever. There's just all these sorts of things that can kind of get in the way of forging those relationships. And so I think that for me, I guess I was thinking about that as I was writing this book, that I was thinking there's so many kind of, there's like a culture gap and an age gap and a generational gap. And but that doesn't necessarily always have to be across like countries. It could just be, I grew up on the West Coast and you grew up on the East Coast, and therefore we have, there's certain things that are just different. And so I think I think I didn't even really realize like how relatable those concepts were, be like in a more general way, beyond like the very specific situation that I put these characters in. So that's been really nice to see. And I think I think it's relatable to a lot of different scenarios of that, just wanting to forge connections, but not knowing how.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. Again, I think it is very relatable for so many people, and to your point, it's relatable probably to most immigrant communities, right, versus just the Polish immigrant community. So, but and particularly kind of that feeling of wanting that connection and or not feeling connected when you first go there and are kind of getting acclimated and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned that obviously you had a lot of your own personal experiences that influenced this particular book. Is there anything in particular, like a particular anecdote maybe that you've included in this book that you remember from maybe your childhood or even as an adult, going back to Poland?
That's a good question. I think when I first started working on this story, I did put a lot of those. There were things like, um, it was a little bit more specific of like making pierogi and like doing it wrong and things like that were like very, very specific from my memory. But eventually, I think like I wound up actually cutting back a lot of those, and it became a lot less my story and a lot more the story of the main character story, Natalia. And so I think that it's rooted in a lot of those real emotions, but I feel like the specifics of it are actually pretty fictionalized, like pretty fictional. Like I do have, an older cousin that I would sometimes spend time with, but we never I never had that moment of like we've bonded over mermaids, we bonded over fairy tales. But I feel like there were other instances like that where we'd be like we like the same music, we like, so I again, like I think that the details are made up, but the kind of underlying emotions I think are pretty truthful.
And it sounds like it probably brought back a lot of memories, right, for having to go through
Yeah.
this process and think about all those things, which hopefully was kind of a sweet thing and a nostalgic thing. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I had to mine some of those memories and to really get at, because I think those early versions were just mostly about not fitting in, mostly about doing everything wrong. And then I kind of had to scale back on that and just kind of be like, okay, well, what's really at the heart of this? And I can't just include like I wanted there to be like a clearly they're not connecting, but there needs to be kind of more like, okay, but there's a shift and now they are connecting, and making that kind of more positive and uplifting and all that, as opposed to me just rehashing the things that like my anxiety from childhood, the
yes,
things that I used to do wrong with my relatives.
exactly, right, or not speaking well enough or whatever it is.
Yeah,
And so,
exactly. Not knowing the right words for things, like all of that, which I do, it is in the book, but like, she is nervous about her accent. She's nervous about not
yeah.
knowing the right words, all of that, all of those things. So
Yeah, which again, I really love that perspective because I know for a lot of people, the accent thing is like a big deal, right? For even when you're a kid, how prominent it is, like, is kind of crazy that you already notice and people comment on it, and it's actually super discouraging, right? So now that I'm older, I try to very much not say those things or not say them in a negative way, obviously, because even me, who I think my Polish is actually pretty good. And people, when I go to Poland, will ask me what part of Poland I'm from, and I always tell them the opposite side of the country. That's all I tell them. If I'm in Gdańsk, I tell them I'm from Zakopane. And when I'm in Zakopane, I tell them I'm from Warszawa, and that way, like, they're always just super confused. But I actually get that comment when I speak in English too. They're like, "Where are you from?" So I just must sound very strange, apparently. I don't know. Like I've gotten very weird things. Like, are you from the South? Are you from New York? Are you from Canada? Are you foreign? Whatever that is supposed to mean. So I think, that even that incident, like that, or like showing that piece of kind of the anxiety was really important, I think, for a lot of people who are bilingual, because bilingualism is a spectrum. It's not necessarily yes, you're bilingual or no, you're not. There's passive bilingualism, there's active, there's, people who are going to be much stronger in two languages or pretty much even in two languages versus others who only really understand, or some can speak better than they understand, which is really fascinating to me, quite frankly. But it was really nice to see that kind of in a book and see it represented, because it's usually not. I don't think, I haven't at least come across very many that do that, and so that to me was also really important, and I think is really important for a lot of our Poloniec kids that are, being brought up here and learning Polish as a second language realistically, to see that their accent isn't the end all be all thing. You can still speak it, you can still try, which I think again is really important. So again, that was something that we really thought was great in terms of the book and that particular experience, or that particular kind of anxiety, in speaking Polish. Um, so this isn't the only book that you've actually written. Obviously, you're a pretty major children's author. I think you mentioned 30 books at least that you've written. Could you tell us a little bit more maybe about what you enjoy most about writing for children?
So I think when I think about it, it actually connects a lot back to a lot of things that I enjoyed about stories when I was young. So, like I said, I loved fairy tales. I also loved stories that were really silly, and I loved stories that were a little bit magical. And those are all the things that I write now. Like, so there's usually like a little sprinkle of fairy tales. So, for example, my first book that ever came out was this one, My Very Unfairy Tale Life. And it's like a funny story about a girl who's a magical adventurer and she solves magical problems. And it turns out the magical creatures are really annoying. And so it's like I took like, the kind of silly, a little bit magical, a little bit fairy tale-ish story, and I put it like all into that book. And then so that's a lot of my stories. But I think is even the ones that are realistic, I think there's still that kind of there's usually like something like there's usually humor, or there's something that like it feels like maybe a little heightened, so even it doesn't so even if it's real life, like it feels like real life, but like a little fantastical.
Yeah.
um but I think the thing that connects them, and I really realize that as I've had more and more books come out and I've done more and more school visits where I talk to kids about, kind of what writing about the things that mean something to you, is that a lot of them are about not fitting in. So even like literally about not fitting in. So I can show you an example of this book, Dogosaurus Rex, illustrated by Kevin Hawkes. And it's about a boy who adopts a dog and doesn't realize it's a dinosaur. And nobody in the town seems to notice that it's a dinosaur. They just think it's a very funny looking dog. And so there's even like a part in the story where the dog cannot fit into the house. So they have to build her a dog. The dinosaur cannot fit into the house. So they have
Yeah.
to build her a giant dog house. And so I feel like even when I'm not writing about like being from another country and like speaking another language, I feel like there's still that like trying to fit in, but not feeling like I quite fit in theme that runs through kind of everything that I write, because I think it's just rooted in my own experience of kind of being a little bit in between two cultures and kind of always feeling that push and pull.
Yeah, no, and I think that's again very relatable for a lot of people who are either immigrants or first generation like myself, because you kind of do feel this push and pull of the two cultures, the two countries, the two languages, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a question. Are you planning on having any of those books translated in Polish?
So I would love to. It's not really up to the author, unfortunately. That's something that publishers, like a publisher will want it and they'll have it, translated, whatever. I've had a few of my books translated into other languages. Like I have one that's one book that's in Korean, which is awesome. One other one, actually, Dogosaurus Rex, it's in Korean and also
Oh,
in Chinese. And I have one of my books was actually translated into Basque, which is such a rare language. And so it
yeah.
was so cool to get my book in Basque. And then there's a few of my books have been translated into French, but only in Canada. So, so they are in different languages, but I keep hoping, but unfortunately, it's really not something that an author can control. It's usually the publisher is trying to
Oh,
sell like foreign rights and foreign publishers, different countries have different basically like publishing climates. So the things that are really popular in one country are not that popular in another. And so they're always trying to find, and then when with picture books, especially, sometimes the illustrations, like it can be hard to, you have to buy the rights to illustrations too. Sometimes the illustration style doesn't really fit the aesthetic of another, like publishing market. So there's all these sorts of things. And then books that are written in rhyme, that's a whole nother thing. I don't write in rhyme,
that,
but
that is
so it's, yeah,
translation.
there's just a lot of things that kind of go into it. I would love for that to happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
Okay. So it's actually interesting that you mentioned the Dogosaurus Rex one is translated into Korean because one of our really close friends is actually a Polish Korean couple. And
Oh,
their kids are learning Polish and Korean at the same time as they're learning English. And it's amazing to see a child's mind work. And so they actually do also get a lot of Korean books. Their grandparents get a lot of Korean books for them. So I'm going to have to tell them to try to get Dogosaurus Rex in Korean since it's available in Korean for them. And their son is completely obsessed with dinosaurs. So I think that'll be right up his alley.
perfect.
So that's really exciting. Um, and so, in terms of kind of your inspiration or what you draw from, obviously you draw a lot from your own personal experience, but is there anything specific, like specific stories or specific characters that maybe you draw from that are Polish authors or Polish stories in some of your other works?
You know, um, let's see. I mean, I think again, it goes back to a lot of fairy tales. I was looking back through my books that I grew up with, like my Polish books, and there's so many, the ones that I was looking at my bookshelf, there's so many Polish ones. Like I found this one, Kopciuszek,
Oh,
a really, really old book from like the
that's a really
I
pretty one, though.
yeah, from
Really
I think it's probably
good.
from the late 70s. Um, and let's see. Yeah, I had like all of these different fairy tale ones, like Bajeczki. Like, it's just so many that are just like these fairy tale like stories. So I feel like I think that's what it just really gets my imagination going. But actually, so for more recent books, so I had been trying to find books that so you and I before we started recording, we were talking about how difficult it can be to find books in Polish here in the States that aren't just like legends or like I feel like there's also a lot of ones that are very didactic where it's just like let me teach you about safety and let me which they're great, they're very useful, but it's hard to find ones that are fun and like funny. They do exist in the world, but it's hard to get them here. And
Yeah.
so my cousin actually one of my cousins sent me a bunch of the Pan Kuleczka books,
Oh, yeah.
which oh my goodness, I love them so much. And I've just my so I read these with my daughter. She's 8, and she's loved them for like even before she could really understand what was going on. She loved them, and I would just read them over and over. We have all of them, and I feel like the humor in them just it's so wonderful that I feel like it's the kind of humor that really works for me too. It's a little bit like absurd. It's a little bit like dry, like it's just I just love it, and so and a little bit ironic, and so I feel like that like there's something there that I feel like was really clicked with me. And I feel like more, especially now that I write more chapter books, because I used to only write like novels for kids and picture books now, but now I write more chapter books. When these are kind of, they're not chapter books. They're like story books, which aren't really a thing in the U.S. It's like more of a, it's much bigger in the Polish market. But I feel like that kind of funny, dry humor is something that has really inspired me as I've been writing for like emerging readers as I've been working on chapter books.
Okay. I'll have to check those books out. I'm pretty sure we have them in our library, because we do have probably close to or over 1,000 books. So there's just we haven't got through all of them. There are definitely some, one hit wonders, and then there's a lot that are we just keep going back to with our kids, and they love to reread them. But we haven't. I don't think we've looked at the Pankulechka, but I do know that's a popular one. So I'll have to make sure we read that one with the kids. I think they'll probably find
Yeah.
it.
I think we have, oh goodness, I have like a stack of them. I think we have like 8 of them. They're just so, so, so funny. And the characters are so relatable and so cute. And yeah, they're really fun.
Yeah. Um, and so, you mentioned you have a daughter. Do you mind kind of sharing a little bit more about what your experience has been in raising or trying to raise a bilingual child here in the US?
Yeah, it has been a challenge. My husband is American. He only speaks a tiny bit of Polish that he learned from Duolingo. So it's so really like all the Polish comes mostly from me, a little bit from her grandparents. And so yeah, so when she was born, I decided I'm going to speak Polish to her. Like that I just kind of knew I was like, I don't know how well she's gonna understand it. I don't know how well she's gonna speak it, but it was important for me, even if I don't always speak it very, correctly in terms of grammar and whatever. I was like, I want her to be able to understand it. So I do, when it's just the two of us or when I'm speaking directly to her, I speak Polish.
Mhm.
And she understands it. When she was very young, she would speak it back to me, but then she went to school and it was English all the time. And after that, it got very difficult, to get her to speak it. So she, I think, takes pride in the fact that she understands it. She really thinks of herself as like, I know Polish, and she does. She really understands a lot of it. I keep trying to get her to speak it, but I'm trying to do it in a way that doesn't just turn her off to it. So, it was just a challenge. But I feel like, I'm doing my best to lay the groundwork. We read books together in Polish. Like, I'm trying to teach her like these are the different letters and these are the sounds they make, so that at least she has that. And then I feel like hopefully, if she takes more of an interest in it when she's older, at least she can kind of build on that knowledge on her own. Yeah, I feel like, and I've spoken with other, so like when I speak Polish to her, she speaks English back to me. And actually I was at the library not too long ago, and there was a man who was speaking, I think he was speaking Russian to his daughter, and she was speaking English back to him. And we had this moment of like, yep, this is and he had the same thing where his wife is American. And so we were just kind of like, we're doing our best. This is all we can do right now. Like, you know, and I know people who are in similar situations, they send their kids to Polish school. Before we started recording, we were talking about Polish school and how like some people have very good experiences with Polish school. I did not. For me, it was a little bit traumatizing when I was a kid. Um, but I also know people who send their kids to Polish school now, and it's lovely. I think it's just something that my husband and I really thought about whether or not that's something we wanted to prioritize, and we ultimately decided like it was like just enough like of a stretch for us in terms of like time and commitment, that it just felt like it didn't feel like it was like exactly what we needed to do, but we were like, let's just try to do as much as we can at home and with relatives and things.
Yeah.
It is a challenge, especially because so I speak Polish with my parents, but my daughter, she speaks English to them. They understand her, and my father speaks English back to her because he can't switch the way that I can. So
Uh-huh.
if he hears English, he'll respond in English. So I keep being like, speak Polish, speak Polish. And it's just so funny because when I was a kid, my parents would be like, speak Polish. And now I'm like yelling at him,
You're
speak
telling
Polish.
them the same thing. It's really weird. The role
Yeah.
model thing as we get older is so weird with our parents.
Yeah. So
Um,
yeah, so it's a challenge, but I feel like we're doing our best. And ultimately, like I feel like she gets, I think the thing that I love about it is that we can make bilingual puns that my husband doesn't understand, where you kind of mash like an English word and a Polish word together, and it's hilarious. And I feel like as long as she gets that, I feel like I'm doing something right.
yeah, no, I think that's really great. And I mean, I am by no means a bilingual expert at all because that is not my, area of expertise, but I have obviously bringing up two kids in a bilingual household, and wanting very much to retain that Polish as much as possible because my husband is Polish as well, so it's a little bit easier from that aspect. Um, I have read about bilingualism quite a bit, and so there's a lot of myths and all that stuff there, and there's a lot of pressure, right, from many people in terms of what you should or shouldn't do on both sides, on both sides. So, I think you do the best you can, and it sounds like you are, and the one person, one language thing works for a lot of people. I know actually a couple of people that I went to school with, they speak phenomenal Polish, and it was just their one parent that spoke Polish.
Mm.
So it's fine. And being passive bilingual is also a thing. And again, it's on a spectrum. So I don't see why that would be a bad thing at all. Like that's still, to your point, really great. And if you guys are able to make puns in Polish or Polish, Polish English, then that's even better. And then just to touch on the point about yelling at our parents, I think this is me. I'm like scolding. My mom's at this point is much better at it, and we catch ourselves much more. But again, our goals and our like what we're able to do is different because all of us do speak Polish, and my mom does actually live with us at least part time. And so I would be yelling at her. I'm like, stop speaking like Polish. Speak only like pure Polish, because she would be like, oh, like daj to do synku. I'm like, mom, do lewu. Can you stop?
It's so relatable.
Right? Albo o, to jest tam, daj to, wyczyści tam ten karpet. I'm like, mom, chodnik, wykładzina, or whatever. Do gabeczu. I'm like, mom, stop. So, and it's really funny because when my son, like, who is now 4, started going to preschool, again, he was really just learning Polish at the time. And so he was learning English as a second language initially. Now his English is much better, but Polish is still stronger for now. We'll see how long that lasts. But it was really funny when he started school and he started speaking English. He sounded like our parents. Like he just, it was the like funniest and cutest thing ever. And like he wouldn't call it the garbage in English. He would call it the garbage. And like apparently the kids were like, why does he say it like that? And we got very lucky because his preschool teacher was actually Polish his first year.
Oh,
So
wow.
she would speak to him in Polish a lot of times, or Polish and English. And she would be like, well, that's just the way he says it because that's the way they say it at home. And it's just like, it's so fun actually to see how they like how their minds work and how they start talking when they're learning 2 languages. It's been really a blessing, and to kind of see how the brain works because it's just fascinating to me. And so again, like I'm sure right now he has like I said a Polish accent when he speaks English, still with some things. So again, the accent thing comes into play even on the flip side, right? When you're coming here. So I can see how, again, my cousin's Mermaid. It's just so relatable in so many different ways for people and for hopefully him as he kind of gets older and realizes more of kind of the meaning or some of the underlying kind of meaning in your book. But yeah. So I guess the other question would be is how your Polish journey has changed and has kind of evolved over the years. So you talked a little bit about going to Polish school. It was not the greatest experience, unfortunately. Maybe we won't name the school in particular.
So I think honestly, it wasn't their fault. It was the situation. So it was like when my family came here, it was only supposed to be for 5 years. We were supposed to and then we wound up because the reason we came to the States is because my father's company, Polish company, had a branch in the United States, and so he
Okay.
was transferred there, and he was only supposed to be there for 5 years, and then we wound up staying. He wound up getting another job, and we wound up staying. And so for those first 5 years, we would go to Polish school. So it was like we lived in Massachusetts. We had to go to Polish school in New York. So once a month. So we had to do all the work because there were no Polish schools near us. I think that's changed now, but it wasn't the case then.
Yeah.
And so we had to do all our work at home, and with like my mom watching over us, and us just like me and my brother just complaining and complaining and complaining. And
Yeah.
then once a month, we'd have to wake up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and like drive like 3 hours and then
It's
sit
like
through school like through all of Saturday and then drive home. It just, and like and we had to try, the goal being to try to keep us at like grade level in our Polish in terms of our writing and our reading
because you're
because
planning on going back.
Poland. So it
Yeah.
was just a very high pressure, like really stressful situation for, and just like exhausting for, I'm sure, my parents and for me and my brother. And so um, when it was decided that we were staying, my parents were like, "Do you want to keep doing Polish school?" My brother and I were like, "We do not." And
No.
so, and I think they were a little bit relieved, honestly. And so have to say there was, I think, one year where there was a teacher who was kind of in the Polish community that was near where we lived, who wound up doing like just a little like satellite Polish school thing where it was like five of us and she would teach us. And that was much, much better because it wasn't like we could do it more consistently. It wasn't this like trekking to, like
Right.
3 hours each way. Um, and exhausted and all that. So that was better. And if it had been that kind of thing, I think it would have been a much like nicer experience overall. But it was what it was. So yes, that means that my written Polish is stopped at like a 10th, it is like a fifth grade level, and that and that like I would still speak Polish at home, and and can read it still pretty well, but writing it is so hard for me. So a
Yeah.
lot of times my cousin will like send me a message through Facebook in Polish, and I'll be like, "Hope you don't mind that I'm responding in English," because if I were to respond in Polish, it would take me like 3 days to write like a sentence because I stress it. Because I'm a writer, so I have to. Everything needs to be
You
like
want it to be
right,
perfect.
and so I can't just like shoot off an email like that's nonsense. Like I have to make it correct, and so that's
Yeah.
really, I think, I wish that I didn't care as much as I do. And I feel like growing up, for a while, I felt like Polish was something I wanted to hide because it was like something that made me different from the kids that I was growing up with. That like all the kids spoke English, which is not true. There were people speaking all sorts of languages in the school that I grew up in, but it was something
Yeah.
like you didn't want anyone to know. And so it was like I felt like it was just this like feeling of like embarrassment about like my parents were speaking Polish to me. I'd be like, "Oh, why are you?" So and then it really wasn't, and then people making a big deal about my last name and not knowing how to spell it, not knowing how to pronounce it. And to the point where even I was like, one day I'm going to marry someone with a really easy last name. And then I did, and then I wound up not changing my last name because at that point, eventually, like as an adult, I was like, actually, I value the fact that I grew up speaking another language and that I can read another language, and that I have that life experience that's unique to me, and then I have this name that's unique to me. And so, yeah, I mean, no, there's a lot of I actually have met people with my exact name, but you know what I mean. Like it kind of encapsulates like my life experience, and so I feel like I've really grown into that, I guess. And it's something that for a long time I never wrote about, in terms of like being from another country, speaking another language. I didn't put those into any of my books for like the first 10 years of being an author. And it's really only been the past few years that I've started to kind of embrace that part of like you actually writing about things that are a little bit more true to my own experience and kind of mining those for stories. So it's definitely been a journey. And I think partly having my daughter and realizing how important it is for me to pass that language and some of that cultural knowledge on to her has made me value it a lot more.
Yeah, I think having kids changes a lot of things, and this is one of them. So we chatted before we started recording. For me, same thing. When I was pregnant with my son, which I didn't know if I was having a boy or girl at the time, like that's when this whole Linguati thing that was the beginning almost of it. Before I even knew that it was ever going to happen, a year later or a year and a half almost later, just buying the books and like starting to think about how else am I going to pass on this language to my children or to my child one day. And it does change, right? You're kind of, I mean, I will say my Polish is the strongest it's ever been in my life, is now.
Mm.
Even though I grew up with my mom who only spoke Polish to us, and we did go to Polish school for, a period of time when we were really young. Um, Despite all of that, now is the time that my Polish is the best. And it's actually through reading with my kids that I've been able to kind of expand my vocabulary and just feel more comfortable reading in Polish. Because I remember, so again, we only went to Polish school until I was about 10, and then we had moved, and it wasn't just possible for a variety of reasons for us to continue to go to Polish school. And so my mom would make us read out loud in Polish. And what did we read? Polskie legendy.
Right.
Polskie Legendy i Opowiedzi, and I'm like, oh my god, this stuff was so like hard to read. It felt like at the time, and the way she would do it is me and my brother would take turns. So she would open up one like legend, and then my brother would have to read it first, and then I would read it second, and then the next page I would read it first, and he would read it second, and you had to read it out loud. Dude, that was the worst. That was the worst thing ever. And you were always really excited if the other sibling had to read first because at least you got to hear it once. So it was easier to read then. But I'm so grateful that she still did that, even though like we were so nervous, even though it was just the three of us, we were still like so nervous to have to read out loud. Um, because it did give us some of those skills and got us more comfortable with it, even though it felt super uncomfortable. And now I'm reading out loud literally every day for at least 15 minutes.
Right.
So it's just so interesting how that kind of changes throughout your life too, and like the way your bilingualism progresses and changes goes through the changes in your life, and it's just so interesting how that kind of happens. And so I think it's really a gift that if we're able to pass on at least a little bit of the language to our kids, then they have some of the foundation that you were talking about. And what they do with it as adults is up to them. And we have plenty of friends who spoke Polish and went to Poland every single summer and all those things, and don't speak it very well now, or struggle with it, or don't feel comfortable speaking or reading in it. And they're all now starting to have kids. And so it's interesting to see how that's going to change again, potentially for some of them. But yeah, so it's been really interesting. And actually now, and I'm going to ask you this question as well, is do you read as an adult in Polish now? Because that's something again that I only read because my mom made me read in Polish. Or like I would read like maybe a very small like magazine or something, a very short article, not a lot. Even like when I follow people on Instagram, if they're Polish, if they, I don't know, the Polish Instagram influencers, they have like paragraphs on their thing. So I'm like, that's too much. I typically like, I skim it and then I'm like, okay, I can't read anymore. Whereas I don't typically have as hard of a time, obviously, in English, reading that much in English. But what I have started doing actually is listening to audiobooks in Polish. And so I found an app. And actually, you can get some Polish books on like the Libby app, audiobooks and stuff. So I haven't tried that because I think most of them are like thrillers and a little bit dark. And that's not something I particularly enjoy to read as an adult. But the app that I'm thinking of is Legimi, that I use to kind of do audiobooks, and I think they also have e-readers and stuff. But as a mom of two toddlers, I just have no time to actually sit there and read. Like
Right.
I usually listen in the car during my commutes. But that's been kind of a way that I've been challenging myself actually to listen more and to kind of learn something new and do something new, and hopefully again and do it with enjoyment because I don't want to actually be sitting there learning how to write a novel in Polish because that's not my goal, but it's to just have another kind of venue for Polish language that I'm enjoying. And I've actually seen that my kids really enjoy the audiobooks too, which has been really cool to see.
I don't know why it's never occurred to me to listen to Polish audiobooks. I think partly because I don't like I work from home, so I don't really have a commute. And so and uh, like I used to listen to audiobooks a little bit more when I was commuting places, but now I don't really do that. And so it's really only been recently my daughter's gotten really into audiobooks.
Okay.
And so but I think it just didn't occur to me, but that's such a good idea to do that because then it's like we can listen to it together potentially. Yeah. So in terms of reading Polish books, so I did it for a long, long time. Like I would read them when I was a kid because I was forced to. And then it wasn't really until I was an adult that I remember somehow I got my hands on a copy of the first Harry Potter book in Polish, and
Okay.
I read it, and I was like, "This is great!" Like it was so fun to read it in Polish because I already knew the story, and like
Yeah.
so then I read the whole series, and then I read like the Percy Jackson books in Polish, and that was like really really fun. So I actually don't read that much on my own anymore. It's mostly with my daughter, but now that you've said that, I'm like, she inspires me to like go out and look for kind of more books that I can read on my own, and then like also audiobooks, because I think that's a good idea. Something I've also started doing, and this is so nice, I think that there's just so much more available now, even just in in recent years, where on Netflix there are all these like Polish movies and stuff. And so, and then I just put on like and for a while I was listening to like watching them with the English subtitles, and that was like messing with my brain. So now I'm like, wait, some of them have Polish subtitles, and this is great, because um then it's like reading but also listening. And so I feel like that's also a way to just kind of like you said, like just kind of strengthen certain vocabulary, and also just have like
Exposure.
I don't know, just like a perspective that's a little bit more like global, because I know what it's like to be a Polish person living here, but like, I don't have that experience of, like, I know it's fictional because there's movies, but like, it's someone coming from a perspective of like, let me tell a story that's set in Poland, that's written by people who live there. It gives you a slightly different perspective.
Yes,
So I love that as well.
it's different perspective, and I think it's different language, really, right?
Yes. Yeah.
When you're reading or even listening to a movie or whatever, the language is different, the vocabulary is different. It's typically a little more robust than what you're doing at home with your mom or with your grandma or whoever, right? So, I mean, again, for us, the language that we're getting from the books that we have through the Linguati library, like my son's vocabulary is better than all of ours put together. Like no
Right.
joke. It's so hilarious because like he just it's amazing, quite frankly. But it's because we read these books, because otherwise we would not use these words in front of him. Like there's just no
Right.
reason to. Like we wouldn't say like nadjeżdża autobus. We would say przyjechał autobus albo jedzie, and like he just uses these different words because one, I think he just really enjoys language and words, but like he would not have exposure to all this other stuff if we were not reading books with him, or watching, TV shows or YouTube or Netflix or whatever in Polish with him. Because let's face it, screen time is real. No one's avoiding it 100% here, at least not at my house. So it just gives you, again, I think more of a well-rounded, experience in terms of the language. It's richer because it's different than what you use on the day-to-day, you know putting stuff away, or just daily life at home, which is really interesting to see, again, how it translates into a child, particularly a child, and their kind of development in terms of language in general. um, I was going to say something else and I forgot. Oh, Linguati. So Linguati actually, we do have a few books that actually have audio players. So they'll actually read some of the books to you. So we have like Roshpunka, which is Rapunzel. So one of those books is actually like the press a button and it talks, or it reads actually the book inside of it. And we're actually working on, and we'll be uploading a few more books that use the chameleon pen. I don't know or the chameleon reader. So you actually,
Oh.
have you heard of that before? So right now we do have a wonderful intern, Justina, and she is helping us record a few more books with the chameleon pen, with the chameleon reader. So all of them will be recorded in Polish and in English, actually. So you'll be able to read those books. And again, one, I love it because for my kid, that means basically he can read a book on his own for 5 minutes because he's not quite old enough to read on his own. But this way he can at least sit there and kind of go through it on his own. And it's another way to kind of get exposure to language without necessarily you having to sit there all the time. Because again, all of us, we're three moms at Linguati, we get it. It's hard to have all the time to sit there all day and read. But we're always kind of looking for new ways to make the language more accessible to the kids and to the families that are here in the US. And so the chameleon pen reader is going to come out soon. I'm very excited. So hopefully we'll have that soon, and we'll have to get your book translated too on the chameleon pen and voiced over. So very excited for those kind of updates in Linguati. Um, so my last question, we're going to wrap up in a few minutes. But one of my last questions is, do you plan on writing more books about kind of the Polish experience, Polish American experience? And do you have any plans for writing any bilingual books? So in Polish
Oh.
and English.
So it's like I said, it's really taken me a long time to start writing kind of books that draw more on my own experiences. So my cousin's Mermaid is kind of the most overt one that's like Polish and English. But I have another book that I um called The Wonder of Wildflowers. This is like a book for like ages 8 and up. It's a novel. And this one actually I feel like kind of opened the gate a little bit. This is like the one that kind of got me into it where every once in a while somebody would ask me like, why don't you write about being an immigrant? And I would say like, oh, there's so many good books out there about that topic. Like, what do I have to say about it? And then there was one day where I was talking to somebody about that, and I said, I mean, unless that story had like magic in it, like then maybe I'd write that story. And then I was like, well, now I have to write that story because that sounds great. And so that's basically what this is, where it's not specified that so it's about a girl who moves from one country to another, and the country that she's moved to with her family is the only country in the world that has magic. And so she's feeling like an outsider because she's from another place, and she's the only person who doesn't have access to this like magical liquid that everybody drinks, that makes them just like a little smarter, a little better, like a slightly magical. And so that one originally had started with me specifying that they were from Poland, but we wound up taking that out because we wanted to be just a little bit more like vague, because it's not exactly our world. It's similar, but it's not exactly. So
Mhm.
I feel like this one really kind of opened the door for me in terms of thinking, like taking like actual things from my own life, and putting them into a larger narrative that's it's the character's narrative, but there are certain things that are based on real life things that happened. um, Before then I would take like a little detail, but I love making things up. For me, that's really fun.
Yeah.
And so this was the first book that I really felt like it really drew on some specific things from my life. And then so then once I got to my cousin's Mermaid, it felt a little bit easier to do that.
Uh-huh.
But that said, it still feels like it's not my natural storytelling approach. I think for me it is really fun to just kind of invent things, but I feel like at the same time I enjoyed writing both of those books so much that they were hard. They were probably the hardest, and I was the most nervous about them being published because they felt so much more personal. Um, but so I don't have any specific ideas right now, but at the same time, maybe my editor will give me another assignment. I don't know. So maybe then I'll be forced to
Maybe,
think of one.
maybe
But
Linguati
yeah,
will whisper some
yes,
ideas.
I know exactly. Give me an assignment and maybe something. So it's certainly possible. I think I would just need like that spark. So for me, like the spark was like, what if it was an immigrant story, but there was magic in it? Or okay, a story
Mhm.
set in Poland, and then me thinking about like visiting relatives. Like, okay, what would that be like? So I think I haven't had that like spark for a story, but but I'm always keeping an eye out for kind of new story ideas. And so I would
Okay.
love to do that, and I would love to work a story in that has more Polish in it, because I think that again, that was difficult. Like I wanted to get it right, but at the same time, it was like a fun challenge. And so I think, yeah, so I would definitely like to. I don't have anything in the works right now.
Okay. So that's exciting. Hopefully we'll maybe whisper a few ideas into your ear.
Yeah, definitely.
Because we've talked, we're like, oh, this book doesn't exist, or this topic doesn't exist in Polish at all, or like there's nothing like that, like that talks about
Yeah,
these traditions or
send
this.
them my way.
So we may need to stay on it right after, and I'll give you a few ideas.
Yeah.
And so I mean, for me growing up here, I didn't grow up reading like a ton of books necessarily, because I think that that culture has changed quite a bit, both in the U.S. and in Poland. And just the number and quality of books is like enormous now than when we were growing up. But seeing a book about Polonia, or like going to Poland and stuff, was just so amazing to see. And I'm so excited that our kids will have that, experience of seeing themselves in your book and stuff. So super exciting. I really, really hope that you continue to kind of draw on those experiences, and what it's like to be Polish in the US or be Polish outside of Poland, and what that's like for kids and for adults or whatever. Because again, it was just really nice to see that perspective. Obviously, like there's a big push for more, I think, diverse books in general in the U.S. From lots of different perspectives, and we have a lot of those books, or I get those books recommended to me quite a bit from different cultures and stuff, and it would be nice to see Poland also represented in that. So it's great that we have at least this one. And again, it's a beautiful book because there are some Polish American books or some Polish English books, but they're not necessarily the greatest. Whereas I feel like this one is really beautifully written and very beautifully illustrated as well. So again, very excited. And for those of you who, again, haven't seen it or haven't read it, My Cousin's Mermaid is available on Linguati's library. I also recommend, getting it, buying it. It's available on Amazon, anywhere else, probably any local bookstores. And if you can, also request it at your local library, right? That's my understanding is it's always helpful
Yeah.
if you guys request books at the library. It gets great feedback for the authors, and also gets more diverse books into our libraries. So again, that's what we're trying to do with Linguati as well. And so we're very excited. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything else you want to kind of say before we off.
I know this is great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and this was fun.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.